Good evening. This is 2020 Church, and I'm Pastor Larry Enriquez. We're on this journey of faith in real life, and we're on this journey of faith in our discovery of what the Bible says about faith. So together, let's continue to grow our faith as we search the Scriptures. It seems that in life, especially as we get older and look back, there are things that we would do better or do different. And there are, at least in my life, I should speak for myself, I have regrets. There are some things I would have never done, I hope. I'm sorry I did them looking back. I'm sorry I did those things. There are some things I'd do differently. And certainly with some measure of knowledge, I would do some things differently. But I hope that, if I were to go back in this life, that I would live more by faith. In other words, really learning to trust God. And there have been so many instances in my life where I know I didn't trust God, and in working things out in my own wisdom and strength, just left life messy and made life unmelodic. I would say this, that, in the music field, you love music that you're playing when it's melodic, in the sense that there's a flow, a beautiful flow, whether it's fast or bumpy, or whether it's moving us to dance, or whether it's moving us to sing or to meditate. There's a flow in all of that good music, and I just think that when a band is playing together, they're in the pocket. There's this melodic sense of everybody being on this same movement. And when you're not walking by faith, that's a missing element of life, and you feel that. It's like it's rough. Now, I'm suggesting that we can feel the melody of God even when things in circumstantial experiences are rough. There's still a flow. We're still in the pocket because we're trusting God. Anyway, if I can say it that way. So as we look at faith, continue to look at faith, I hope that our faith is growing. I want to say that sometimes it seems that we're called to make our most important decisions or choices at a time when we have the least amount of experience to guide us. That's why that expression that we have, if only I had known, or if I had to do it all over again, those are things I have more recently been saying. And I would say that I hope I would live by faith. But those statements tell me exactly why we need to follow Jesus and live trusting him. In fact, the Bible says that we live by faith because most of life is invisible. All of our future is invisible. And if you want to live that melodic life, then trust God and live by faith. In fact, the Bible tells us in the book of Hebrews, where we're bouncing off of, and we're going to talk a little bit more about Abraham. It says, and without faith it is impossible to please him, for the one who comes to God must believe that he exists, that he proves to be one who rewards those who seek him. I want to live that life. I want to be pleasing to God. I want to live a life that pleases him. So that translates to living a life that's trusting him, trusting his character, trusting when things don't go my way, trusting when life is sad, trusting when life is difficult and troubled, trusting God when I'm not in control. Of course, a lot of my life, I think I am in control, which is a fallacy, but that's another sermon. So most of our life really is about allowing God in all those areas where we have no control. It's living by faith. Here's a proverb, Proverbs 3. I was reading it for another reason, but it just screamed faith to me. So let me read to you a portion of Proverbs chapter 3. I'm going to read just from 3 to 7. By the way, it also reminded me how often I need to read the Proverbs and how often I neglect them. So, wisdom literature. Here it goes. Do not let kindness and truth leave you. I love that. Don't let kindness and truth leave you. I always say I want to be more kind. And I find myself sometimes going, well, I would be kind, but they're not kind. So I'm not going to be kind back. What kind of Christian life is that? Well, that's my confession to you. Pray that I'm kind, especially when they're not kind. Anyway, that's a whole nother sermon too. Do not let kindness and truth leave you. Bind them around your neck. Write them on the tablet of your heart. What is that metaphor? What is that metaphor for? Well, it's saying, man, will these two virtues be branded in your soul, a part of your very makeup? That's why it says the tablet of your heart, and then the outside that it's around your neck. It's pointing to two things. One, that it's outward, it's visible, and the other that it's internal, and that the outward is moving from an internal reality. Why shouldn't I be kind? Why shouldn't I be kind? Because God is kind, because the Lord is kind and He's in me. Because I'm so blessed. Let's be kind. If we do that, you will find favor and good reputation, both in the sight of God and in man. That's a general statement, not always, but the Proverbs are giving us these general truths. Here's the part I want to read to you. Trust in the Lord with all your heart. That means to live by faith. Trust in the Lord with all your heart, and do not lean on your own understanding, but in all your ways acknowledge Him. Well, we have very little understanding. As I said at the very beginning of this little talk we're having, much of life's decisions were made when I had really little or less information than I would like to have had. Many times in my life, I should say some big times in my life, decisions were called upon me to be made when I didn't have all the information. Even when I first accepted Jesus, I had really very little information, but it was like bingo. Something happened inside the very heart of my brain that said, yes, true. It was like ding, ding. Something matched my inner soul to the degree I could not deny it. And I said yes to Jesus with very little understanding. Well, that was, in one sense, maybe love at first sight. But here's the deal, is that in that, I learned to trust God in the process of walking with Him, of knowing who He is, experiencing the reality of the Word and the truth of that Word in my own heart. But in much of life, things have come my way, and I've been, for instance, I was asked to lead an organization as its top guy, so to speak, and I didn't have much information about the organization really. I didn't understand what it meant to hold that kind of responsibility, and I went, okay. And there was a part of me that said, trust God, trust God. I said, I'll help you for a while. I was there for 14 years, probably 13 years longer than I thought I'd be there, helping them do that. But it's learning to trust God. And I didn't fully trust Him on the journey. I said yes at the front end, thinking yes. And there was another experience like that too, where I said yes and thinking, okay, Lord, I'm going to trust you. But the journey means I need to trust Him there too, not just yes at the front end, but yes in the journey of whatever I'm going to experience in this life. So when I said yes, I had to continue to live by faith, trusting God, learning and doing my part to learn and again to keep kindness and truth at the depth of my soul. But I had to continue to trust God along the way, and I didn't always do that. But that's what I wanted to do. And that's what the Bible is calling us to do, to trust the Lord with all our hearts, to not lean on our own understanding, but in all our ways to acknowledge him, to trust him. Do not be wise in your own eyes. Fear the Lord and turn away from evil. It will be healing to your body and refreshment to your souls, or rather to your bones. So it talks about our responsibility on the journey, but our responsibility is only going to find its true worth in the trust of God on that journey. Well, there's more of that proverb that's important to read, but I want to get to Genesis chapter 12. And we're going to backpedal just a tiny bit, because I ended last week's message with kind of I thought it was a little comical, when Abram went down to Egypt, and then he had the experience with Sarai being put into the Pharaoh's harem, and then that decision by the Pharaoh being kicked back out to Abram, and with that, came all these riches. So let me go back to that in just a little bit, because the Lord had said to Abram, "Go from your country and your relatives and from your father's house to the land I will give you and show you, and I'm going to make a great nation out of you." And we have this covenant that's brewing here. So Abram went his way. I'm just briefly going through this. And so Abram went on his way as the Lord had spoken to him, and Lot went with him. Now, Lot is his nephew, and we don't know a lot about Lot other than he's kind of a sidekick, a subordinate to Abraham. Abraham is his father figure. Abraham is his elder. But the story focuses on Abram, who becomes Abraham, and Lot is a part of that life. The New Testament tells us that Lot was a righteous guy, but you don't always get that sense when you actually read the narrative, the story of it. But it says that Abram took his wife and Sarai and his nephew Lot, their possessions that they had accumulated, and they went on their way and went on this journey. And the Lord is again speaking to him and revealing himself to Abram in a way where Abram is growing in his ability to trust God, because he's knowing who God is. And then it comes to this part that tells us that there's a famine in the land. Now, he's sent to go to the promised land, but now in verse 10, now there was a famine in the land in Genesis 12, verse 10. So Abram went down to Egypt to live there for a time. Now, the Lord never told him to go down to Egypt. It just says he went down there. What's moving him down there? The fear of a famine, the reality of a famine, and the fear that went with that. But I don't think that he was supposed to change course because there was a famine. God had still been taking him on this journey to the land that he had promised him. And the land he had promised him was not Egypt. So when I read this, I go, you know what? Fear motivated him to go to Egypt. And fear is not faith. Fear is on the other end of the spectrum of faith. I'm not saying it's the opposite, but it certainly isn't a cohabitant of faith. They don't live together very well. So there's a famine, and Abraham goes down to Egypt, and as he's heading to Egypt, he goes, "My wife is so beautiful." He concocts this scheme with his wife and says, "Sarai, because you're so beautiful, don't say you're my wife, because they're going to kill me for you, to get you." So he concocts this scheme for his own safety with no regard for his wife, motivated by fear. I guess that's the point of this, is that he's motivated by fear to save his own skin, even at the expense of Sarai. And it so happens that once she's in the harem, that calamity comes upon the Pharaoh, and so he essentially kicks her out and discovers it's it's his wife that she's actually married, and goes, "Why didn't you tell me that?" Pharaoh said. "Here, now take her and all the stuff I gave you and get out of here." So he actually leaves all these goods, but his movement there and his way there is really not faith. He's on a journey of faith. We find this very backstepping that fear prompts in his life. Circumstances create fear, and now he obeys the fear. That's my interpretation here. So I'm reminded that as we go through this life, and life presents its various circumstances that we may not like or in fact despise. And most circumstances we don't like are something outside of us, something that only God is in control of, and sometimes it's the product of someone else's decision. And we're not in control of that either. And we go, okay, now I've got to adjust to this difficult person or persons in my life. It could be a boss. It could be somebody who's over you in the marketplace. It could be a child who by their very actions and age are over you and hurting you. It could be a spouse. It could be a neighbor that by their very actions are putting this kind of thumb on your life, or at least you feel like that. And so if we're not careful, all that induced fear and uncertainty will move us in the flesh side of our lives to make up for that with fleshly actions, self-preserving decisions, not faith-driven ones, not faithful ones, not other-focused ones. They'll be about my own skin. So in this little message, may we be encouraged to go that as we start the journey of faith, we have to live out that journey in our circumstantial living in lives. And when we fail at that, then let's get up and let's go, God, okay, that was fear-driven. I want to be faith-driven. And God works with us in that all the time, because our whole life is that. We're not condemned. We're no longer under condemnation. You're no longer under condemnation, the Bible tells us, with clarity. He loves you as a child, his child, and wants you to grow in trusting him. So let's grow. Let's start afresh. So when I first started this message, remember I said we often find ourselves saying, but if I only knew. Oh, if I had just, we look back with regrets, and I'm telling you that you don't have to look too far. How do you live your life now? Make decisions right now, today, that are faith-driven decisions. And so we find Abraham and Sarah and Lot and all their possessions now acquired through from the Pharaoh in Egypt, because God causes all things to work together for good. And all the servants that they have acquired, and they move again into this other territory of life on this journey. And in Genesis chapter 13, we move there now. So Abram went up from Egypt to the Negev, he and his wife, and all that belonged to him, and Lot with him. There's Lot. Every time the word Lot comes up, I go, oh, okay, yeah. Now, Abram was very rich in livestock, silver and gold. Well, some of that he had on his own doing, probably ill-gotten gains at some point, certainly not godly gains, but a lot of it came from the Pharaoh. And he went on his journeys from the Negev as far as Bethel, to the place where his tent had been at the beginning, between Bethel and Ai. Now, let me remind you that this idea of Abram living a life in a tent is very indicative and reflective of what I think the Bible means to tell us. That people of faith are just traveling through. This isn't our home. Christ is our home. And heaven is one day the place where we'll all dwell. that place of paradise, that place where we'll all be with those believers and with the Lord as our shining sun. And so the tent reminds us that we're pilgrims and we're just traveling through. It says that he had a tent and an altar, and that was his life. Now Lot, who went with Abram, also had flocks, herds, and tents. The land could not support both of them while living there, for their possessions were so great that they were not able to remain together. So time has passed, and they've grown, and there's been this movement of production. Life is bigger. That's how life gets sometimes. As you get older, as you move along, you acquire things, and they're just things. Sometimes you go, ugh, things, but okay, that's a different sermon too. So now Lot, who went with Abram, also had flocks, herds, and tents, and the land could not support both of them while living there together, for their possessions were great. And there was strife between the herdsmen of Abram's livestock and the herdsmen of Lot's livestock. So there's tension. So remember, in the New Testament, it says that these things were written for us that we might be instructed by them. So let's really be instructed by what's being said here. It says that there's tension between their herdsmen. So Lot has staff and Abram has staff, and in one sense they're kind of a part of their families, and now there's tension there. And here's what the next verse is. After it says, and there was strife between the herdsmen of Abram's livestock and the herdsmen of Lot's livestock. Now the Canaanites and the Perizzites were living in the land at that time. Why is that little sentence in there? Why that verse? Why even say that at all? I believe that because when there's tension, when there's strife, when there's possibility of struggle or even division, there's always sin. There's always a sin element, an enemy element waiting to take advantage of our wrong moves, our selfish moves, our difficult moves, our moves without God. The Canaanites and the Perizzites, they reflect the flesh, the enemy. So like when there's tension, all the more act godly. Trust God. Do the right thing. I remember once somebody telling me a story about these two people in a church that were fighting over something that they had both owned. Now they were trying to work that out, and they were yelling and screaming at each other within the church, trying to work it out before the church. And then, one of them yelled out, "It's my right." Something of that nature. And his older brother, was behind him at the table where they were having this out. And his brother went up closer to him and said, "What did you say?" He says, "It's my right." And he whispered, but yet loud enough for them to hear. God gave up his right by sending his son Jesus, and he got wronged for you and for me. And so the brother sat back and says, "I give up my right. Do what you want." And from there, it actually worked out that they were all benefited. There's something about my right, that we live in that era. But I want to tell you that it isn't the Christ way. Trust God. Trust God. So when they come to this place in their lives where there's this tension, Abraham says to Lot, "Look, you pick. Where do you want to go?" So Abram said to Lot, "Please let there be no strife between you and me, nor between my herdsmen and your herdsmen, for we are relatives. Is the entire land not before you? Please separate from me. If you choose the left, then I will go to the right. If you choose the right, then I will go to the left. See, he's not motivated by fear. He's motivated by faith. He's trusting God. Lot, strife, we're not going to have it. You know why? Because it takes two to strive, and I ain't striving. Pick. Wow. From fear to faith. May we learn to live trusting God. Even if you believe it's costing you something, well, let it cost you something. Live by faith. Trust God. Give up. Do the right thing. God will take care of you. Trust in the Lord with all your heart and lean not unto your own understanding. In all your ways acknowledge him, and he'll direct your path. Go in peace. Live by faith. Hope to see you this Sunday.